No one expected it to happen. In the very heart of the Vatican, at a place where millennia-old secrets are kept, where the walls remember silent prayers and loud vows, something occurred that shocked even the most hardened witnesses. 3 weddings, 3 hearts, 3 people whose fates intertwined at the darkest moment in history, and all of this happened in one night. The night in Rome was strangely quiet. There was no noise from cars, no usual evening hum of the city. In the dark alleys of St. Peter's, there was complete silence, except for the steps of tall monks carrying a mysterious process, unseen by most. Their faces were hidden by hoods, and their hands were clasped in prayer. Through the windows of the Vatican Palace, one could see the internal lights flickering, creating a fantastic glow against the backdrop of the night sky. Everything here was arranged according to an ideal plan, as if fate itself wrote this day, and only its whim determined what would happen next. Those who came here that evening knew that this moment would change their lives forever. The Pope was not planning to conduct an ordinary ceremony. He knew the time had come, and his resolve was ironclad. This night was special. Some said it was meant to be the end of a great game, others, the beginning of a new era. Among the crowd gathered in the hall was Anna, a young woman whose eyes revealed her fear. She was preparing for a wedding, but not the kind every girl dreams of. Everything was different. The anticipation, the uncertainty, and the mystery surrounding the wedding could not help but worry her. She felt as though something dark and inevitable was growing within her. The Pope, standing before the golden altar, awaited the arrival of 3 young men. According to ancient tradition, each of them was to make a special promise. They could not refuse, they could not hide. Their fate had already been sealed. This was not just a sacred promise of love, but something far more important. These marriages were not about love, they were about power and control. Anna remembered how she had first seen him, the one who stood in the shadow among the monks and priests. His dark eyes seemed to see through her, and his presence was so strong that she could barely breathe. He was not just a priest, not just a monk, he was someone far more dangerous. His name was forgotten, but his face, it could not be forgotten. She heard footsteps approaching her. Her heart began to race. This was the moment. All eyes were fixed on the central aisle, where the first 2 grooms appeared before the altar. Their faces were hidden by hoods, their shadows seemed to merge with the night. 2 young men, like 2 blind instruments of fate, were walking toward their destiny, unaware of what awaited them. The third appeared later. Right after the first swore eternal love, and the second signed his fate on the scroll, the third silently walked into the hall. His eyes were not like the others. He was confident in himself, unlike anyone else. His steps made no sound, as though he were dissolving into the air. And then, at the very moment when the night seemed ready to engulf everything around, the Pope raised his voice. 3 weddings, 3 promises, all 3 of courage. But there was something strange in the way he spoke. These words were not ordinary vows. Tonight is not just a sacred union, he said. This is not just the binding of souls. Tonight, you are required to give much more. Your life, your choice, your actions, all of it will be a sacrifice that will affect the future of the entire church. These weddings are not symbols of love. They symbolize your devotion to a cause from which there will be no turning back. Anna stood and listened, feeling cold sweat covering her forehead. She understood that this was not just a ceremony. It was the omen of something much greater. These 3 weddings were not about love. They were about power. 3 people, 3 marriages, and 1 dark union that they were to seal. The light from the candles illuminated the faces of the attendees, but no one could see what was truly happening. That night, even the most devout began to doubt what was taking place in the very heart of the Vatican. 3 times in one night, while everyone watched. These words echoed in her head. Anna couldn't understand what had happened. Everything seemed like an ordinary ceremony, but the atmosphere in the hall was so tense that it couldn't have been a coincidence. A sense of foreboding would not leave her. She tried to focus, but her thoughts were a jumbled mess. The eyes of all the guests were fixed on what was happening at the altar. But Anna had the feeling that something much greater stood behind it than just the vows they were making. Everything seemed too orchestrated, too precisely calculated, like on a chessboard where every move determines the outcome. The third groom, standing at his position, did not look as confused as the first two. He stood straight, like a statue, his hands clasped in prayer, but his gaze was cold and resolute. This was a man who was not afraid of what was to come, a man ready for his life to change forever. But what did he know that the others didn't? The Pope continued reading the prayer, and at that moment, Anna felt the tension in the hall intensify. Behind the monks, priests, and guests, there stood a silence that could be cut with a knife. There was no joy in the eyes of those present, no anxious thrill that accompanies wedding ceremonies. Everything felt like a ritual, and Anna understood that she had become a part of something far more terrifying. As soon as the Pope finished reading the vows, all three young men lowered their heads, and a strange flurry began around them. Their hands were tied with church ropes, the wedding rings lay on the altar, but no one was in a hurry to put them on. There was something ominous about this, something that made Anna shrink with fear. She knew that each of these young men was participating in something far more terrifying than just a vow before God. At that moment, one of the priests standing at the altar signaled, and the doors of the hall suddenly closed. No one could leave. Suddenly, bright lights came on in the hall, illuminating every detail, every face. Anna felt her heart skip a beat. Eyes full of betrayal, full of fear, and even hatred stared at her. These people knew this wasn't just a wedding, but no one dared to ask questions. The one conducting the ceremony was not just a spiritual leader, he was the main executor of an unknown plan that had yet to be completed. The Pope slowly approached each of the grooms without saying a word. At that moment, a cold wind passed through the hall, as if the earth itself had shuddered. This was not an ordinary ritual. It was a cult hidden from the world, a sacred ceremony that took place in the Vatican every decade. Anna heard one of the guests whisper something to their neighbor, but the words were so quiet that they were impossible to understand. Then everything changed suddenly. Are you ready to accept the gift and the curse that this union will bring? The Pope spoke, but his voice was different from usual. It was low and deceptively calm. He was not asking a question, he was stating a fact. All three grooms lowered their heads at once, and Anna, despite her confusion, realized that this was not just a question. This was an order. One of the young men with delicate features stood up and said, "Yes, I am ready to accept this gift, although I understand it may cost me everything." He looked at Anna. His gaze was not expressive, but there was something mysterious, something troubling in it. She felt her insides contract. What was happening was part of something much darker than she could have imagined. Another, with a more confident demeanor, lifted his gaze. His look was completely cold. "I am ready. The path I am on is inevitable. Let it be so." The third, the one who had remained silent from the beginning, with a face that seemed completely lifeless, also confirmed his readiness. But his answer was not with words, but with a nod. It was a gesture that for a moment caused Anna almost physical pain, as if his silence was a complete denial of all that was human. When the Pope heard their answers, he turned to the gathered crowd. His face was as cold as stone. Everything spoken here is not just words. These vows have nothing in common with those you are used to hearing at weddings. Today, you become part of a great and dark cycle that was set in motion long ago. Do not be deceived. There is no turning back. You are already part of something greater than your own life. And all of this is just the beginning. The Pope raised his hand, and all three men, who had been standing before him, knelt. But at that moment, in the height of the ceremony, something unexpected happened. The doors of the hall opened, and a woman walked in, tall, with fiery red hair and eyes full of resolve. She was not part of the ceremony. She was a complete stranger, but everyone present seemed to freeze in anticipation. Her steps sounded like an order. She walked confidently, as though all of this was happening by her will. The Pope turned to her, and his face hardened. "You are late," he said, but his voice showed no anger. It sounded as if everything that was happening had been predicted. The woman stopped in the middle of the hall and looked at the three men. Her gaze was not gentle. She paid no attention to the Pope, as if he were just a pawn in her game. "I came to finish what began long ago," she said calmly, but her voice carried a power capable of destroying everything. And as soon as she spoke those words, everything in the hall became silent. Even the light in the room went out, and for a moment, everyone present forgot what was happening around them. This was not just a wedding celebration, it was something far more terrifying. The one standing before them was not just a woman. She was part of history, part of a dark conspiracy that had been forged centuries ago. Anna realized that all this was only the beginning of what was to happen that night. In the silence of the hall, time seemed to stop. Every gaze was fixed on the woman who stood at the center of the ceremony, and it was clear that she carried with her not just words, but fates. In her eyes burned a fire, but this fire was dangerous, like a flame capable of consuming everything around it. The Pope did not speak. He knew what had happened. He knew that despite all his efforts, he would not be able to change what had already been decreed. The woman turned to the three grooms who stood on their knees, unable to move. "You have all accepted your fate," she said, and her voice echoed through the empty hall. "But now you must become part of the great cycle, and perhaps this is the only thing left for you." She stepped forward, and all three rose, as if with a will that did not belong to them. They were more than human, more than just servants of fate. In their eyes, there was no fear. They had become part of something ancient and inevitable. Now they belonged not only to the Vatican, but to the forces behind it. The woman stepped toward the Pope and whispered something in his ear. He nodded. Everything was decided. When she left the hall, the doors closed once again, and the night swallowed all that remained. People began to quietly leave, unable to comprehend what exactly they had witnessed. 3 weddings, 3 hearts, 3 lives, intertwined at that terrifying moment. Only Anna remained, standing in the shadow, feeling how the events of the night began to weigh heavily on her chest. She knew that she would never be the same, and though she could not fully understand what had happened, one thing was clear. This night had marked the beginning of the end.